بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum everyone. So we're restarting the session after our Ramadan break, and today our guest is another cousin of mine, Ahmed Arastu, and I've sent them the biography that you sent me, so they have a sense of what you do. Basically, he's an architect, but inshallah we'll see more about what that means and how he got there, and I don't know, maybe some of the practical aspects of what it is that you do. So Ahmed, I don't know how you want to start. Usually I start by asking either tell us what you do now, what does it mean to be an architect, or if you want to tell us the story of kind of how you got to where you are,
Sure.
or if you have something else in mind, then that'll be fine too.
Well, like lots of people in our family, there was significant pressure for me to study medicine because I come from a family of doctors. Yeah. So my father's third out of 12. His eldest brother actually is an architect. So I have to confess, I had influences growing up, but I also saw how hard it was for him in a family of doctors, because materially, as well as kind of reputationally and conversationally, you're black sheep, you're different, because the conversation is always going to be about medical stuff at your family gatherings. But here there was an architect, so I was always drawn to that. I've been drawing since I was very small. I've always been drawing, like since I was 5 years old. So if you like to draw, architecture is a very natural, organic sort of application of that skill, is one way to say it. Because drawing really is, at its fundamental, people misunderstand what drawing is. It's actually a way of thinking. The only way to truly understand something is to draw it. Even if you don't know how to draw, if you try to draw something, you'll understand it in a way that you don't understand it just by looking at it.
Can you explain that? That's not intuitive. Explain that. That's not intuitive to me. What do you mean by that?
To understand something, its physical characteristics. So architects basically deal with the organization of space and the construction of buildings. And the larger kind of umbrella that architecture falls in is design. So design is onto itself a different and distinct thing from architecture. But all architects in some fashion have to engage in what's called design. But if you study design, like I went to a graduate school for design, even though my degree is in architecture, you can design anything of any scale, everything from a phone to a car, to a bed, to a house, to a city. And architects have to deal with all these scales at all times, because we need a spot for your phones, for your car, for your bed, and for your city. And all these things that we design, everything around us has to be designed, whether it has a designer or not. Everything has to be designed. God designs the world, nature. That's our greatest book, basically, to study from. Like if you learn from nature, you become a wonderful designer anyway, and you don't need any degrees, really. But society also has these requirements that we have to speak a language that human beings can understand, because fundamentally design is an act of communication. Design is an act of solving spatial problems and mechanical problems, but it's also fundamentally an act of communication, because the main task of a designer is to solve a problem and organize the solution, and then create the language of the solution, and then be able to speak that language to another human being to build it or maintain it or execute it. So that's why architect is sometimes used as a term to refer to software, or to use or the architect of a plan, or an architect of a policy. So design is a way of thinking. Now, to get back to drawing is a way of physically notating, using a language of lines, a solution to a given problem. So if the given problem is, I'm trying to design a newspaper, and I have an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, your lines, the first lines you draw are going to be, how much of this is going to be a headline? How much of this is going to be the text? How much of this is going to be the page number? There are all these little problems in organizing that space. And that same problem, you can apply to any design problem, whether it be a room, a bed, a city. So in architecture, the three disciplines that tend to kind of like we have professional designations are landscape architect, and urban designer. And the landscape architect is someone who deals with plants and living things and ecological sites, which may or may not include buildings. Sometimes it might be parks or drainage systems, all sorts of things, but that deal with the scale of the landscape. The scale of the building is for architects. Architects tend to work on buildings, and buildings can be anything from, houses, villas, to large corporate parks for one person, to 10 people, to 100 people, to 1,000 people. And cities have tens of thousands of people and millions of people. And all of these problems are somehow dealt with in our discipline. So there's a zooming in and out of scales, and there's a zooming in and out of detail in the problem. So the first thing like a designer has to do is figure out what the scale of the problem is and what the purpose is. Like if there's a given client or a person you're designing for, they will come to you with requirements and problems you have to solve, basically. So I started this trip just like anybody else. I drew a lot. I drew what was around me. I had the influences of the people in my family, like my uncle, who was an architect, and they encouraged me. They never told me that I had to be a doctor, but I wanted to study medicine because it's a very romantic notion. My dad's a doctor. He has a very, alhamdulillah, successful office in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And it'd be great to be able to work with him. And, my aunt works there, my mom works there. It's a great family business. And it's kept us, prosperous and comfortable for 40, 50 years. So there is a little bit of risk involved in not doing that. And it takes a leap of faith. But actually the person who encouraged me the most was probably my mom and my dad. My dad said, you don't have to do what I do. I think because his older brother's an architect, he's always been interested in it. So it was kind of like one of those things that was in his head that he wanted to do. And as much as I like the notion of designing cars, and there's another discipline called industrial design where you design other things that aren't buildings. And I initially started the journey in architecture through that. Like I was actually interested in industrial design, like I want to design cars and planes and spaceships and, maybe even, iPhones. But the college I ended up going to didn't have an industrial design program. They only had an architecture program. And so I ended up just kind of self-selecting myself into that. But I tried pre-med, I tried engineering, and in the end, I ended up second majoring with history of art, because art history and architecture are quite related. And there's a lot of overlap in those professions. And the history of art is fascinating in itself, because it's kind of if I'm interested in drawing, painting and drawing are ways that human beings communicate to future generations what their culture is. And specifically in pragmatic terms, how to solve certain problems so you won't have to re-solve the same problem over and over again. Everything that we know is because somebody wrote it down, and the art of writing and the art of image transmission through generations is a thing that we've been doing since the Stone Age. And that's the only reason we know any kind of history, really, because there's artifacts. So as architects and designers, we are constantly in that conversation that's been going around, for 30,000 years. There's cave paintings, and they can have everything to do with the drawings or the buildings that someone makes now, because they're still human problems and they're still human beings. So there's a big picture to it too. So that aspect of it was very natural. Like that's a thing.
Can you share your sketchbooks that you have there?
So, sorry.
The sketchbooks that you're talking about, can you share that with us? Oh,
sure. So like every time we try to solve a problem, we make sketches. Let me try to find. This is like a recent one, so it's more doodly than actually solving the problem. But so they're kind of like a visual diary. It's whether or not you end up studying architecture, you can just note. It's a way to organize your thoughts and take notes, and it really is kind of like a dialogue of like the way architects use lines. One of the most important concepts in architecture is you can describe any object through three views. A plan view, which is like a top view, a side view, which is called an elevation, and a plan, the plan and two elevations are all you need to really describe any object of any complexity, and to communicate to someone else how to build something, whether it be a building or an object. You have to be able to know what it looks like from every side. There's usually three sides. And that sort of a language, there's a language of lines that architects have to learn that, okay, when you draw a certain way, this represents a door, this represents a column, this represents a window. Once you learn that language, then you can use that language to describe anything, really. So in the ancient times, like Da Vinci and like even Euclid, the way they would develop geometry was to communicate to people how to I think in the 16th century, it was for fortifications, because fortifications would have these really crazy angles. So we had to learn all that geometry in school. But now, of course, it's easy because you can just build a model of what you're going to design in the computer. And we use software to do that. But we're still using the discipline of geometry, of what's called orthographic projection. And that skill set, it can be used in many professions, because like in medical imaging, like MRIs, they're cutting slices of the human body. The architect cuts slices through a building. So there is this kind of sense of, to know something from the inside, you have to know how to represent it in a way that you can communicate to someone else.
So we have Ruqayya in the group. She has an interest in architecture, so I'm hoping she will be able to tap into you and ask some questions.
Sure.
And the rest is, I like the fact that you've kind of broadened the perspective. It's not just about this particular like job or this like career called architecture.
No.
It's like it's a very broad, maybe applicable thing that might cut across many different fields that might interest all of you.
Well, I'd like to think architecture is an idealized generalist profession, even though the economy and capitalism pushes us to specialization. Architects try very hard to be generalists, like what's called polymath, somebody who knows art and science and uses their whole brain. But practically speaking, we do serve capital. Like we can't make architecture without clients, and the clients will have requirements that are completely antithetical to what our aesthetic kind of instincts will be, to make something beautiful or to make something ecologically sound, to something that generates more energy than it uses, even, because that's where we should all be going, really, to make a positive difference. But oftentimes, if the client has certain requirements, you have to serve the client first, and then all those things are second, because they're the ones that are paying the bills, and that's why I can have a house. It's like, so there is a priority, there's a compromise that has to be made, or negotiation every day, basically, between practical realities and our aesthetic kind of aspirations. Probably true of all professions, really, but in architecture, it's a little bit more, I want to say, from what I know from my friends who practice other professions, it's a little bit extra in architecture. You have to be prepared to do about 3 times the amount of work for half the amount of money. So it really helps if you have another source of money, like your parents or a benefactor or another job even, because it is a job of passion. I would not recommend it to anyone who's not willing to take half the pay for 3 times the amount of work for at least a portion of their life.
Explain why is that the case? Why is that proportion there?
Because I think architecture, you're always designing 3 times. You're designing once to convince the client that you can design. You're designing the second time to solve the problem for yourself. The 3rd time is the one that actually gets built. So everything you see built around you was designed 3 times, and there were huge compromises made between the concept and the reality. So it's always 3 times the amount of work that you think it is. If you think it's going to cost $10, it's going to cost $30. So only the clients that have $50 can hire architects. And they're only going to tell us they have 10 and we're going to spend 30, but they actually have 50. And that's the only reason any art museums, any beautiful monuments like the pyramids, anything that you can point to and say, this building outlasted the user, outlasted the society. It lasted 1,000 years. It was because they did that. So the Empire State Building is a good example. It's like that was designed in the Depression and it was put up in 18 months because that's when construction was cheap. And we still refer to it as the icon of New York. It survived everything. It survived a bomber going through it because it was built very well, but it was built 5X. It wasn't built 3X. So you start with 1X, but be ready for 5X. So it's like you have to manage your expectations. That's true of time. That's true of money. And that's true of how much work you think of yourself you put into it. Because if you want something to be meaningful, you got to put yourself into it, right? It's an art profession. It's fundamentally an act of self-expression that you're trying to get onto the page. It's a little more than just a job. And most meaningful careers are just a little more than just a job. You put your heart and soul into it, and you have to be ready to get hurt. Because, the first thing they teach you, I went to Harvard, I was very fortunate. I went to a good school. The first thing they teach you at Harvard is you're dumb. You don't know anything. And then you're ready to learn then. And then they break your ego, like it's a hard trip. It's a really, even the even the most basic architecture education requires this sort of mental reconstruction, so to speak, and it's painful. There's no way to do it without the pain, and to be willing to, and again, you'll pull all-nighters, and there's a whole kind of sort of weird culture about it that hopefully it's getting a little more positive, and there's more like, people survive and they become fulfilled humans in the end, but it's a really long, hard trip. So be ready for a really long, hard trip if you choose this profession. And that's why I wouldn't recommend my kids do it unless they're really, really passionate about it. So, or have a backup, have a benefactor, or be ready to borrow some money to make the ends meet for the first like 10 years, I guess.
Is the artistic skill a necessary prerequisite for this? Like being able to draw with your hands, or?
I would say you don't have to know how to draw to be an architect, but you have to begin, to study. In the end, though, you will be making lots and lots of drawings. And by drawing, sometimes it can mean, in a very basic sense, just lines on a page, like in a sketchbook. That can be a drawing, but we make very sophisticated renderings as well that are three-dimensional, like Pixar. Like we make three-dimensional models of environments, virtual environments with like 3D trees, buildings, cars, even birds now. Because right now the game industry is so advanced, you can create a virtual reality very easily. And our computers are like, this is a supercomputer. We call it a phone, but this for Rizvan and I know, because we're Gen Xers, that there was a time when this didn't exist. And this was a very basic thing that was attached to the wall. But this is basically a supercomputer. This can process so many polygons per second that it is now possible to make virtual environments that are very immersive, that have moving water, moving clouds, and they're becoming commonplace now. So instead of building a still image like a drawing, we can give our client a movie of what their building will look like in the city that it's in. But again, that also raises the stakes a little bit, because now everybody expects a movie. So there is an aspect of technological kind of prowess or advance there that goes along with the profession that is helpful, but also kind of, you have to adapt to it.
Great. Asya, let's hear your question.
Sorry, I don't know if you mentioned this already, but are you like a I guess, contractor or a free agent, or do you like work for a corporation? And generally, do architects are they like independent workers, or do they work for like a institution?
So I myself work for a firm called Roger Ferris Partners in Westport, Connecticut. It's a firm of about 30 people, which is on kind of the medium to largish side of an architecture firm, because most architects are either singles or firms of 5 or less is considered to be like a small firm, or like an average size for an architecture firm. But there are also very large multinational firms, much larger than ours, that are hundreds of thousands of people. There's one of the most like kind of prestigious and famous firms in the United States is called Skidmore, Owings, Merrill, SOM. And SOM has like offices in many, many countries, and there are hundreds of thousands of people. So I believe the largest firm in the world for a while was this firm called Gensler. And they had, I think, 3,000, maybe 10,000 staff in like 100 offices. I couldn't say for sure. I've been with my company for Roger Ferris is the main architect, so it's like Roger's company. I've been with them for about 19 years now. So I've seen it kind of go through iterations of it's always been about like a 10 to 20 person business, and then they had multiple offices, and then they combined them. And architecture firms also go through cycles of, like based on the economies. Like when COVID hit, all the commercial projects froze. So a lot of our projects became residential and institutional, like schools and performing arts centers. And the good thing about Roger's firm is that he has work of all different scales and all different types, building types. So he really is like a quintessentially the best kind of architect, in my opinion, which is a generalist. He designs lots of different kinds of buildings, and he tries to use the same idea in many different contexts. And that's, to us, that's intellectually exciting, rather than being a specialist firm that only does one kind of building over and over and over again. Because that's also the case. Like there's firms that just do hospitals, there's firms that just do sports stadiums, and they or airports. They get like very good at one particular, because those are very large, complex projects that require so many resources that it's untenable to take a project on like that from scratch without previous knowledge.
Can you explain that corporate structure? Because I think it transfers maybe to law firms, other things as well. You have partners versus other people who are whatever you are. Like, what are the cogs in that wheel of that particular firm?
Typically there's associates and then there's partners. And partners, I believe it's different for every firm, but they, sometimes they share in the profits. And typically jobs have like a fee, but in what I've heard from most cases, I don't know this from like my own experience of having a firm or anything. The fee is very quickly burned out. Like most architects are operating at a loss from like, day 3 or day 6, like they've already kind of burned through what the fee was. And the rest of it is all like a passion project. But I know there's ways that it can be profitable and the ways that firms can grow. It's just a very different kind of, it doesn't have the same demand as medicine or law. It's very kind of extra, like it has its own kind of cycles with the construction industry, but it's not as, I would say, stable.
So how can your firm be sustainable if, given what you just said?
I think you're
obviously making a living and you're raising a family. How is that possible if that's the case?
It's the case in the sense that you don't starve, but you'll never make the kind of money that your lawyer and doctor friends are. But at the same time, I'm also very fortunate because I went to good schools. I think I got a very stable job that I've been able to keep. Most architects go through many, many iterations. Like they change jobs every 3 years or every 5 years, and they're building their own portfolios. And the portfolio is another thing I should mention. If you're interested in this profession, it's not just a resume. There has to be a visual component of your skills. So in a way, I think your initial question when you asked, like, do you need artistic sort of a skill set? You definitely need a skill set. You need to be developing a skill set of drawing, painting, or some kind of visual art that sort of shows that you know how to think about something on paper, that shows that there's a visual thought process that's available that somebody else can access. And a portfolio usually consists of like it could be totally mixed media. It could be all sorts of different media, but typically architecture portfolios are problems that are assigned in school. And then there's critics and juries in school with the process of when you pursue a design profession. Usually the way it's taught is in what's called the studio method, in which you have a little bit of lecture like a regular college course, but the bulk of your time, from like 2 to 6 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, will be in studio. And studio is basically one-on-one time with you and the professor a little bit, and a lot of production time where you produce things like drawings, sketches, renderings, and you pin them up on a board, and a jury of peers of your own classmates and also of the professor and whoever the professor has access to, they critique your work, and then you go back and you reiterate. So design is what's called, I think, an iterative process. It works with, it's never, like I said, the 3 solutions. That's just like kind of like a basic sketch. Most of the time, those 3 solutions are made of hundreds of trials and errors, and they incrementally get to the solution of what your final product will be. And there is no final product. Don't ever consider design as a product. Design is a process. It's a process. Our buildings that are already built, like I worked on a 1 million square foot headquarters building in Stamford, which is like 2 or 3 towns down, is always changing. Like you still see interior renovations going on in that building, and we tailor-made that building for one specific client. But the economy, that's when there was it was finished in like 2008, 2009. Then the economy, there was a financial crisis, and the tenant we designed it for was taken over by the British government, the Royal Bank of Scotland. So we tailor-made it. It was like a suit that we tailored for that client, but then the client went away. So now that building is still there. It has to be repurposed, but there's demand for commercial office space. So then people go in and they renovate. Sometimes we get those jobs, sometimes we don't. It's like, it's very much a roll of the dice, but the initial investment of the building, that was something that the bank was willing to make. And it's like, $300 million, $600 million project.
Wow.
And it can be empty the next day. We don't ever know. It's like, and that's kind of the fun of the whole thing, but that's what I mean by cycles. Now, given those cycles, it is possible to have a 9-to-5 existence in this. And it took me, I've been there for like 19 years. It took me about 10 years to figure that out. The first 10 years, I didn't know when I was coming home. It was tough. It was like being a medical resident. Like you had 24-hour days. I had a 27-hour day once when I hit traffic on the way back from work. And subhanAllah, we survived all those things, even with kids. Somehow we got through. but it's never a sure thing. Let me tell you, it takes a lot of faith. So,
Wow. So we have, let's go with Ahmed and then Sakina and then Ruqayya.
So you talking about how the firm was like very small, it's like 30 people, right? Like I watched a couple of legal shows and like I want to be a lawyer, so like I realized that like some legal firms have like 50 or 30 associates, and that's like average or something. And you say like 30 is like partners and like associates and everyone. So how could it be that it's so small?
Well, to be totally blunt about it, there is a lot of money in Connecticut. Fairfield County, Connecticut is one of the richest kind of counties in the United States. Like it's like a Beverly Hills or like, and you need that to be able to do architecture, because the architecture needs two things. It needs culture. It needs the life of the city. So it basically feeds off of the energy of New York City. We're about 40 miles from New York. So all the people that have businesses in New York, like large executives, so a lot of them will have houses in Connecticut. And so the clever thing about having an office here in Connecticut, to go to your previous question about how can we sustain this, is because we can do both commercial and residential work. So that's another value of being a generalist firm, is that we can sustain, we have a steady stream of work from repeat clients. And a lot of our clients can weather these storms, these economic storms, because they have money, and they have this need to use the money to build something cultural, either their own house or an institution like a gallery or like a building that they want to be more than just real estate. But a lot of times it's just real estate, because the real estate market here is also very, it's like California's. It's always buoyant. So there's always money to be made through the real estate. So there's incentive to redesign and rebuild things. Otherwise, that's very difficult in other parts of the country, where if the economic impetus is not there, the architecture cannot exist. And architecture and design, you'll need a solution. You'll need a drawing to get a permit for a building or to get a permit for an addition. But those basic tasks can be performed by nearly anyone. And it doesn't have to be as highly designed as like a custom project. So a lot of architecture can exist without architects. That's another one of the kind of pressures on the profession that I should mention, because I feel like the demand in medicine law is a little bit kind of like more established, but that would also might be grass is greener sort of thinking. So, but that's at least from my point of view of my cousins who study medicine and stuff. Their gripes are different than my gripes. Their gripes are like malpractice insurance and like how much time it takes to get educated in the first place. Now, architecture does take, a master's degree. I have a master's degree, but it only took me like 6 or 7 years to get a master's degree. Whereas, a doctorate takes a pretty large chunk of your life. And you can get an architecture degree in pretty much 5 years. If you don't want the master's, you can do a Bachelor of Arts, and you can be drawing immediately. As long as you know how to use the software, you can pretty much get a job in any firm just drawing. So there's always kind of like demand, but the interesting projects go up and down with the economy.
Sakina?
Yeah, so I guess my question was, you were talking about how you can get a bachelor's in architecture, and there's also like a master's option as well. So like within your firm, is there like a lean towards a certain type of degree? Do more architects have the master's versus the bachelor's?
I think I've seen architects from pretty much every level, because the actual work of architecture, there's enough kind of just raw labor, like the task is so monumental of designing, and most of the work of architecture is making sets of drawings. And these sets of drawings are hundreds and hundreds of sheets. So somebody has to draw all those things. And it's sometimes very tedious, but at some point that has to be documented somehow until we have machines that can just basically look at our model and just reproduce it in real life, which is probably going to happen in our lifetimes, but not quite there yet in terms of the labor market, because the people that actually build the buildings are contractors and subcontractors. And these are people that work with their hands that may have varying levels of education and communication. So you have to be able to communicate your idea to many, many, many different kinds of people, many, many different kinds of languages in a way, because the drawing that communicates the idea of the project, sometimes we can call what we call computer rendering, is like a photograph, right? Sometimes, but the drawing that communicates, oh, where does the pipe go versus where does the door go, is a black and white, very technical looking drawing, with its own certain language that you have to learn. So the people that draw might not need masters. The people that design the things that the other people are drawing might need masters because they might have to know about other aesthetic concerns. Like I find I deploy my art history knowledge sometimes because when I'm making a rendering, they'll want like a painting on the wall because the person has an art collection. So you have to know like, oh, okay, maybe this will go with this. And then suddenly you're doing interior design, right? So interior design actually is a profession that is distinct from architecture, but it's rapidly becoming integrated into it because it's more energy efficient to use old buildings and to rearrange the furniture, so to speak, than to build something from scratch, because the carbon footprint of building something from scratch is so exponentially higher sometimes than repurposing, an old warehouse or an old building. So increasingly that will be the case as we get more and more cognizant of how much, what the carbon footprint is. So to answer your question, any and all kind of degrees and levels of exposure, as long as you know the software that you're drawing in. So like AutoCAD is the software that pretty much everybody knows. And that's how you do what's called drafting. And the drafting software is kind of like the bread and butter. There'll always be work to be done in AutoCAD. It might not be like the most interesting work or like the rendering. Like what I do sometimes is I get to make movies sometimes. So it's a really fun job, but it took me a little while to get there because you have to learn, then you suddenly have to learn how to, move cameras around and stuff. So it's kind of like the film industry in some ways, whereas you're telling a story and a narrative, and that narrative is feeding this other production process, which is the production of drawings and models too. Actually, like we use models, like this is the model of our house I built out of Lego, but it still functions the same way because this is something that allows you to hold, to understand the dimensions, to scale, and things like aids like this, they're still produced, even though we do everything virtually. You still need things like this to convince a person to say, oh, this is better than something else. So
the difference in education will probably translate as difference in pay. And then
I think so.
Like
I think
and
so.
what you
Like
just said,
the
like maybe the
masters,
difference in how interesting the work is, like grunt work versus more
absolutely.
creative work.
Absolutely. My masters allowed me to, I think, skip to the narrative part of it without spending too much time in the drafting part of it, even though at least at Harvard, the first thing we did was learn how to make a drawing with our hands, no computers. This was like in the 90s. And we use what's called a parallel bar. It's a bar that slides on your desk, and we use it to draw parallel lines. And special pencils called lead holders that we'd have to sharpen in special. We'd have to buy all this equipment, like special erasers that are motorized. And there was this whole process of making your drawing, because the idea they're trying to get across is you have to be very committed to the drawing, and you have to say this piece of paper has to be really thick. We have to use like really thick watercolor paper, which is we used this French brand called Arches 90, and it was like really thick because you would be erasing and erasing and erasing and redrawing and redrawing and drawing, and they'd have this dust that you have to sprinkle onto the page so that your thing could roll and your lines wouldn't get erased every time you roll it. So all these skills, they're kind of lost now because now everybody uses what's called AutoCAD. Like I mentioned before, if you know AutoCAD, you can pretty much get a job in any architecture firm because there's always plenty of AutoCAD work to be done. Now the trend is towards building what's called, there's a software term called Building Information Modeling, or BIM. And what that means is instead of making a two-dimensional line drawing on the computer, which represents like a slice of the building this way or this way, we're making the entire building in the computer, like we're simulating the building in the computer. And that's awesome in some ways, because then you can slice it anywhere you want and the computer will figure out the slice for you and you won't have to redraw it all the time. And you can put in like every nut and bolt depending on how much memory and how good your machine is. But it's just starting, so there's still a new language to be learned there. But if you want to skip ahead, the Autodesk is the company that makes AutoCAD. They have the main software that everybody's using right now is called Revit. So if you learn the software called Revit, you'll be able to pretty much, build and design anything. And then most architecture firms are heading towards that direction. Now the software I use is called SketchUp, because SketchUp is designed for sketching and conceptual design. It's called conceptual design, because to get to the point where a building can be modeled in the computer with all that detail, you have to agree on a concept first. And the conceptual design is when you think of, is this going to be a triangle or a square? Is this going to be a circle or a rectangle? And there are big questions like how many trees are we going to knock down to build this building? Or where is it going to sit on the site? What site are we going to choose? We have all this land. We have land here, we have land here. Which site is better? Those big questions are conceptual design. And that's kind of the fun of it. So in a way, I get like the fun part, but it took me a little while to get here. And that's probably because I have the master's I have. And I had to go through the steps of learning all the in-between steps. So I learned how to communicate with the people that are doing like all the, the drawings. And I have to make drawings myself sometimes. But the conceptual design is when you're dealing with the questions of sometimes what it looks like, what material is it made of, where does it sit, how does it look like in different lights. So those are all questions I have to deal with pretty much on a daily basis. So I'm always making models in the computer and then throwing them into the rendering software. I have a second machine that just does rendering, 3D rendering. And so I can show like, the senior designers, well, if we go with option A, it looks like this. If we go with option B, it looks like this. If we go with option C, it looks like this. And it helps them navigate those choices so they can go to the client and then the client can decide. And the client might choose a completely different option than we like. And we have to be ready for that.
Rokhaya?
I was just wondering what made you decide to stay with your firm instead of starting your own firm, like, because you have a master's, so you would have that ability to start your own firm, but what made you decide to just be a member of an already existing firm?
So there's two things, there's two aspects to that. One aspect is I never really got my license and got my board certification. So that's like on the list of things I'd like to do, but I'm having so much fun doing what I am doing that I was like, and the second part of that is I would never have the network that my firm has. There's no way for me to get the kind of clients that we have. There's no way Royal Bank of Scotland would hire me. And then the only reason they hired Roger was because he knew somebody. So it's a network. Architecture has to, like the Medicis in Florence, like the Mughals in India, they had the buildings you talk about and remember, always there was a network that created that building. And that network has to exist before the building exists. And I could try to develop my own network the way my dad did, like he started his own practice. But the way he got patients was he got fed from a hospital. The hospital just gave him patients, right? I have nothing like that. So for me to do that, I could do that if I pursued my license and I did that, but I'd be starting from zero. And it's also a significant amount of risk. My kids were pretty much born when I started, 2 years out of grad school. So economically, I was like, this is a lot of money on the table but the hours are long. But slowly we got to a point where, it became a 9-to-5 job. I could see my kids and, get a regular salary, decent, modest, like enough to live here. But I couldn't live here without my parents' help though. I think our house would not be as nice. Our schools would not be as nice. But, inshallah, there'd be a way to do it if you're sufficiently motivated. It's partially my own inertia too, because I became comfortable and complacent. And, I'm younger than a lot of other parents, I guess. But around here anyway, the people that are parents that are our age, the kids are much younger. So it's also where we were in life. And it might be something I pursue later, like if I don't go back to school or something. So that's partially the reason why I stayed with my firm. Also, Roger keeps it interesting. Like, because Roger's also a Harvard grad, he has an intellectual interest. So I got lucky. I just happened to land in a place where it's stimulating work. There's different scales and different clients every day, and you never get bored. Because boredom is usually the greatest enemy to, boredom creates creativity sometimes, but boredom is the reason people keep changing jobs if it's not economic, And here the economic part's already taken care of. So now you just have to take care of your own kind of intellectual development. And you could argue that by starting my own firm, my intellectual process would be different. But I also don't know if I have a strong enough idea about what the firm would be about, And on most firms that are successful, they need a strong idea at the core. And I tend to align with the one I'm in. I drank a lot of the Kool-Aid, so I've been, brainwashed too. So to see it from an outside point of view is difficult for me. But I don't leave it out of the question. Like, it might be worth pursuing. The other kind of part of the answer to the question is I am kind of more interested in design than I am architecture. Architecture is a very specific kind of design, and the logistics and the problems of building buildings are sometimes more than a normal person should have to bear, because the buildings become like your children, right? So if I had to choose between my children and the building, I would tend to choose my children, but a lot of architects choose the building, and they end up with, you know, multiple marriages, broken families, and it's common. They're out of the house 360 days out of 365. You know, it's like a lot of these what used to be called star architects, which is a horrible term, but architects have become like, you know, rock stars. I can give you examples like Zaha Hadid or Frank Gehry, or the one from the 1950s that you might be familiar with, Frank Lloyd Wright. Even if you read the stories about Frank Lloyd Wright's personal life, they're not necessarily compatible with our values, right? So it's a balancing act. I got very lucky that I was in a firm that remains prosperous and is still successful from my point of view. I mean, a lot of people say maybe it's not like, you know, cutting edge or anything, but it's because we have repeat clients and we have a very specific kind of work. There is a little bit of comfort there that I'm not willing to give up just yet. Maybe later.
Yeah,
but
that's good to know. So work-life balance is one of the things that we've been asking all of our interviewees about. So I think what you just said spoke to that. I have some local friends here. Some of you know Adel Musabji from the local Chicago community. So some of the kids know him and his family. So I had a similar conversation with him privately, and he's a lawyer, a corporate lawyer. So he has the option to, like, normally you keep on going up in position,
right?
But he doesn't want to at some point. He likes what he does, and he doesn't want, like, he actually, like, you know, even though he's supposed to be promoted,
exactly,
he doesn't want to be, because the higher paying job is more boring, or it's just not what he wants to do.
It's responsibility. I mean, I'm also, you could argue I'm being a little immature and I'm just kind of like staying away from the responsibility. I love the idea of competence. I think competence has been looked over for excellence. In my experience, there is no excellence without competence.
Explain what you mean by those two.
So I see, like, becoming a partner requires first competence, then excellence, right? I could pursue that excellence, but I want to become good at something before I do that. I want to get really good at what I do. Only the wisest person knows how little they know, right? Every day I'm learning how little I know about architecture, and I've been doing it for 19 years, and it's every day there's more unknowns. And I feel like I still have a lot to learn before I can ever approach being what's called a partner or something, to have like a title, you know what I mean? I'd rather do good work. And that's a very kind of, you know, arts people, crafts people tend to think in those terms of the quality of the work is more important than what people think of it, or the title that it brings, or even the, you know, the economic benefits of more responsibility. But there is something to be said for just getting really good at one thing. And I know that kind of goes against the whole generalist idea, because you have to be generalist to be a good architect, I think. But like, I still don't think I draw very well, even though I've been doing it for so long. So I feel like I should keep going with that. And that's also the mark of passion too, because that's something I'm kind of passionate about. So, but
do people around you see what, like, think of your choice as being kind of like a negative thing? That why aren't you moving up in the corporate ladder?
I think a lot of people.
How do you deal with that reaction from people around you?
I think I've outlasted at least one of the partners in our firm. So he ran the whole commercial side, and I had a great experience with him. He had the unfortunate task of breaking me into the whole profession, so I would not want that task, because, you know, I'm a very idealistic kid who just graduated, you know, Ivy League, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm everything, and he had to like knock me down into, no, you start from the beginning, print this drawing, learn how to use a printer. It's like, you know, and you'll be doing menial tasks like organizing files. You know, it's like my first job, actually, before this job, I had one other job. And one day they were like, we need to reorganize the library. And I was like, so, and I thought, oh my God, I can't be doing that. So beneath me, I can't. But now I'd be like, oh yeah, I'd be happy. I'd learn so much, you know, it's like, because that's like, the boring work actually becomes how your brain relaxes after a while. Like, repetitive things are very zen and relaxing, but you only learn that as a 40-year-old. As a 20-year-old, you're like, no, give me the big commissions, give me the big project. No. Happy to do the repetitive work. Because there's enough other, and again, this is also because where I was in life, like, you know, we had kids pretty early, And, we're on our own. We're far away from home. Like my sister bought a house that's like 5 minutes from, four houses down. She can go, Mommy Baba's house anytime. We're in Connecticut, which is 2.5 hours away from Pennsylvania. So it was like there's a learning curve with life too. So architecture has to dovetail with that if you want a regular 9-to-5 profession and you want to keep everybody happy. So there was compromises there, I think. I still question my judgments about, whether I shouldn't pursue more responsibility. But I found this happy medium of like, I'm kind of doing what I love. Like there was literally a day when my boss asked me to build a project out of Lego, and that was my job for the next 3 weeks. And we presented it in New York. I presented my Lego model in New York, and there was a big party and everything. And it was like, wow, this is like the life of a rock star, right? So after that, I'm like, I'm kind of happy where I am. And I think that's what my boss was trying to do, was trying to prove that, you can still have it all for 15 minutes. Everybody gets their 15 minutes of fame. But, if you're addicted to fame the whole time, then you got to pursue other things. I'm the kind of guy, I'm like, this is good enough. Now, if I get my kids through college, then after that, I might get bored. Maybe then. So.
Ahmed?
Ji.
Ahmed Badari, go ahead.
I have 2 questions actually.
Sure.
So first is you said you're not a partner, but you said you've been with them for like 19 years.
19 years, yeah.
So what is your title there?
I have no idea. I call myself a senior designer. My daily existence involves working with the partners on the senior design. There's usually like a person who's in charge of the design aspect of it and not the production aspect of it. So I work with the design side, and typically, every day I'm producing iterations of different projects, and it could be a skyscraper 1 minute and it could be a villa the next. It could be, and it's kind of like a production process. So I would say the best way to describe it is probably senior designer. I'm a visualization specialist if you want to get technical. But the thing is, I kind of know I feel like I have all the benefits of what a partner has, in the sense of, people respect me. It's people ask me questions. I like monetarily, maybe it's more money. Maybe you get to more, but I've been to events and things. Every time we win an award, we get to go to a dinner and things, and there's little perks, right? But I haven't felt this sort of like need to say, oh yeah, well, I haven't made partner yet, the way you would in a law firm or in a medical firm, because I know for a fact there's not that much money to begin with. Like there's not a pie that I have to fight for. That's not the fight I want to have to do. And to be fair, I can only do that because my parents were so supportive. If my parents weren't supportive, there'd be much more pressure for me. Like, if I want my kid to go to Harvard, that's hard. That's a lot of money. I'd have to, I need some financial aid to do that. And I might even ask, and, I have one daughter in college, and she's in Boston at Tufts. We're already starting to feel that. And, that there's some incentives there to like, oh, maybe I should ask for more authority or more kind of responsibility. But I should say, the last time I didn't even ask for a raise, and I got one automatically, because I didn't ask for many years. And they're like, I just have to keep in track with inflation. It's okay. Now, if you're motivated and you want to be like, a millionaire or something, you can do that. You can, but it's going to be, remember, money costs life. If you want to make 6 figures, it takes this much life. If you want to make 7 figures, it costs 10 times more life. And that life is your life. All these people die young. But, you can make 7 figures. There's people who make 7 figures, 8 figures, 9 figures even. These are people that are not more than 5 or 6 degrees away from us. They're maybe even 3 degrees away from us. But that's not what life is about. Life is about like seeing your kids, spending time with them, eating well. And, I'm a Gen Xer, so for me, health is wealth after COVID. So.
And like, I remember you were talking about it earlier. You said for the first 10 years, you didn't know, you didn't know what time you were coming home and stuff.
That's right.
How were you able to deal with that? Like having a wife, having kids, how were you able to
Well, my wife is very accommodating. She gave me this big room so I can put my toys in. These are all my toys, by the way, not my kids. So I'm the best case scenario. Not everybody's life looks like mine. I don't know why I'm this lucky or grateful. I'm super grateful. I pray every day at Fajr. Please let my life continue the way it is. But it's when we first started, we were also very young. So a young person's capacities are different than an old person's capacities. I wouldn't call myself just old yet, but I'm definitely older. When I had kids, I was probably in my 20s and 30s. Most people are in their mid 30s, 40s. Like around here, it's kind of expensive to have a kid, and sometimes they're on their first kid. And we already had 2 kids in middle school at that time, right? So it was like, and everything just happened at once. Like the all-nighters I would pull in the office, I'd be pulling all-nighters because our kids wouldn't sleep. So, you know, to a young 28-year-old or a 31-year-old, that's the same thing. You're staying up for the same reason. You just have migraines the next morning. So I had to get past my migraines too. That was an obstacle. But, you know, we got through it. It was hard. It was not easy. It's not easy even in any other profession. Even for medical residents, they pull 24-hour shifts all the time. So, you know, usually you get a rest 12-hour break after that or something. But the thing with ours is, it's not a system of like, oh, you're on call, you're not on call, or you're on call, you're not on call. Ours was completely dependent on the schedule of the client. And the client is a fickle human being with lots of money. So when you add money to a fickle human being, not only do they have the ability to do anything, anywhere, anytime, they're going to want everything at once. So you really have to cater to these people, and you really have to like, you get destroyed by them a little bit. And eventually the experience of that is that you land the job, you get the fee, and then I think from what I don't know from firsthand experience, but at least from secondhand experience, the firm can take on fewer jobs like that then, because that was like worth 10 little jobs, right? So it's like the one big job can pay the bills of the 10 little jobs that don't pay the bills. And then the fun job is the one job that probably doesn't pay any bills, you know? That job is probably like, that's not paying, you're probably operating at a loss when you do that, but that's the most fun one. We designed this pool house that looks like a snorkel, right? This gigantic lap pool that's like, if you go on our website at Ferris Arch, I think it's published now, it's like, there's a 60-foot lap pool. And then we designed a house that literally does this. It's like an L, it's like a Tetris piece that's landed into the ground, and it's pink. It's like, it was like this beautiful strawberry, like Faluda, kulfi colored pink, you know? And it's like unlike anything we've ever seen. It's like, it's beautiful. It's like, we find it beautiful anyway, because we have these tastes, right? We're modernists, but that job probably didn't pay the bills, right? The job like RBS, you know, that paid the bills. And that was the all-nighter job, right? So usually one thing pays for another, but for us, the architecture is all the same. Our kind of higher calling is the aesthetics.
So it sounds like you're talking about this tension between aesthetics and your ideals and whatever the client wants. Does it ever lead to moral dilemmas where it's not just about aesthetics, but it's like, you know, you're being called to do something that's haram, that's like are there any questions like that or problems like that arise in architecture?
Well, sometimes these clients are very wealthy, so they might have financial interests that are in all sorts of, you know, places that you wouldn't want to be associated with, especially banks and hedge funds and things. So there are these kind of questions. Our kind of way around that is like, we should design the best building we can, that if it outlasts the client, it's good for the environment, it's good for the city, it's good for the visual environment, the kind of like, so like RBS was a big corporate headquarters building. I spent like the first 5 years, night and day, that was all I was doing. It has a huge facade on I-95. So hundreds of thousands of people drive by it every day. So it's like a gigantic billboard, really, like right against the side of the highway. So that building has a very clear visual public function. So there was a kind of this other pressure there of like, well, this building is probably going to outlast the client because it's such an expensive, big building. It's like the only building like that we've done, I think, that was that large at the time, because we're usually, you know, we do little villas, single family homes, very large single family homes in some cases, but, you know, modest size, not huge, you know, skyscrapers. But now we've been asked to do skyscrapers too in New York. So a skyscraper, if you define it as anything over 10 stories, we have one that's under development that's like 55 stories, and one that we just finished in Boston that's 12 stories, and one in New York that's 10 stories. And it's the first time we've ever done anything like that, besides this building in Stamford. So when you build in the city, you're building for everybody that inhabits that city, and everybody that walks by it, visually, they're going to be confronted with this thing. So the moral dilemma there is kind of like, well, the client might ask for something that's only in their view when they own the building, but the building's probably going to outlast them. They might sell it to someone. So what's good for the future of the city? So you have to kind of think in the future, what 10 years from now, what is going to be considered, you know, a good building, or a green building, or an aesthetic building. You know, all these ways to describe it. So when we built this RBS building, which was Royal Bank of Scotland's headquarters, it was the largest green. There's ways of saying how green it is. So it was a LEED silver. LEED is this standard that they use to say there's LEED platinum, LEED gold. These are really cheesy kind of names, but they do refer to a certain metric of performance that says, okay, it has to do certain things. It has to recycle its rainwater. It has to be built out of sustainable materials. The materials couldn't have come from too far away, or because the carbon to get the materials. We start tracking all these things, and we start hiring experts that do nothing but track all these variables of how green a building is, because now it's becoming like a dangerously close to like a marketing term, right? And once something becomes a marketing language, then the content of, oh, whether it actually performs as a green building, sometimes that's lost. So that's always a moral dilemma. Like, how green can we make it before the language takes over, right? The actual performance of the building. How do we guarantee that, it uses more daylight, that it uses less electricity, it uses less heating, all those things from our point of view before the client even asks for it, So it's a negotiation. It's constant negotiation of how much good can you get in there, whereas how much good does the client actually want in there, and then how much are they willing to pay for, and how much are they willing to say. The really best clients are the ones that are so forward thinking that they're trying to design a work of art, so they're already willing to spend that money, But some clients, no matter what you do, they won't be convinced of that, and they're always going to try to be saving the money anyway. So you can't, in good conscience, ask them to spend the money that they want to save, because they hired you for that purpose, right? So, but usually they don't hire us to save money. They hire us because they want to spend the money on something that will outlast them. But we're very fortunate to work in a firm like that. Not all firms are like that. A lot of firms, the bread and butter, like the kind of the things that society needs, a lot of times they won't need that level of care and interest, and you have to be willing to do like 5 or 10 jobs like that, like just picking carpets for office spaces, or speccing furniture, or doing even these jobs can be interesting. Any job can be interesting depending on your point of view, but that's always a dilemma of like how intellectually invested is the client in it, and can they meet you halfway,
How did you find this position? Was it the Harvard connection that brought you?
It was the Harvard connection. It was purely, this is the case of the network did all the work for me. Like, I didn't have to slog through. I went to career fairs, and I got rejected from a lot of firms because we graduated right after 9/11. The economy was not so great. And it wasn't like you were getting hired right out of school. But I went to one of the career fairs. I was just there. And my thesis was about an old steel mill, because I grew up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So it was to repurpose the Bethlehem Steel's buildings. And one of the architects that was presenting at the career fair had worked on a project that had to do with Bethlehem Steel. So I was very drawn to that. I was like, oh, wow, that's what my thesis is about. And I was slated to work for them for a summer, but that summer I got Lyme disease. So I only went to work for one day in Connecticut, and then I came back to Bethlehem, and I was in the hospital for a week. But then I ended up working for that firm for I think about 11 months out of graduation. And he was also a Harvard grad. And then, that was the shock. That was the first initial shock of, what, this is what work is like? I have to wake up at this hour and go to drive the car to this. And it's like that whole sort of experience of your first job. And then I lasted about 10, 11 months there. And I looked at the network, and Roger's name was next, and he had an open position, and I've been there ever since. So this is one of those cases where if you put all your energy into the network of the school, the brand of the school, or the market that you plan on getting work in, the city that you plan on getting work in, it will have benefits.
We're just about done with time.
Okay.
If you all have any questions, or like one last question I'd like to ask you is, if you have advice, maybe not architecture specific or design specific, but
Mm.
like just from your experience of life, what advice would you give these young kids who are kind of at this juncture in life where they're going to think about their futures?
Well, my great uncle always just say, keep your interests varied. Keep your interests varied. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Find the things you like and work towards them, but always have a thing on the side, or the thing in, like, it's always a matter, for me, it's foreground and background. Your foreground task that you're using to make money, or to keep yourself propel yourself in whatever track you're on in school, like whatever major you're choosing, keep that track, but keep your passion on a different track, and then merge them if you can, because then you'll be unstoppable if you can do that. If you can do what you're passionate about as your main job, you won't have to worry about anything. And part of my profession, the reason it works is because of that, because I'm able to engage my passion. But be ready to compromise. Be ready to compromise a little bit of this for a little bit of that, but keep that as keep trying to find what you're passionate about, and be ready to be passionate about many things. Don't ever tie it to one thing and say, I'm this. Never define yourself by a title. Just the first thing you should get rid of in your head is a title. The titles are designed to keep you down, not keep you up. I will say from experience, I'm not a partner, but my boss let me tag along in the helicopter once. These are things that happen. These are things that only happen once, and I don't want it to happen. You know, I'm not saying I have to do that every day, but I don't have a job title, but this was yet a thing that I did, right? So it is possible. It is all possible. All your dreams will come true if you work towards them. But just be ready to compromise. And you know what? I leave half of it to Allah. I'm every day I'm like, I only can control this much. The rest of it is out of my control. So figure out what you can control it well, get good at a thing, and try to follow your passion as much as you can, but always be ready for compromise at all times. Learning how to compromise will never fail you in life. Everything from like you're learning who your spouse is to learning who your kids are to learning what your profession is. Don't be held by titles and labels. Like find it for yourself through your own experience, I think is the best advice I give it. And keep a sketchbook, like keep a diary or a sketchbook. Keep a conversation, an active conversation with your own thoughts. And if they're visual thoughts, then you might be right for this profession. Like and if you're interested in this sort of 3D world, download SketchUp and start using it. Photoshop and SketchUp are the two best tools that I use, I think. I hope it wasn't too rambly.
No, thank you so much, Ahmed.
Appreciate
This is
it.
excellent.
Thank
one
you.
of the great things for me is also like getting to know either friends, cousins, in a new way. We may never have had this conversation. I've known him since we're the exact same age.
We visit each other in college.
I'd walk into your bedroom in Bethlehem, and it would look very much like what's behind you now.
What's behind
There'd
me.
always be a train set. There'd always be Lego.
Yeah,
like these are all your passions.
Little things. Yeah. It's a great thing when you can engage your passion in your profession. I mean, it's the same thing with Rizwan too, man. I was like, the fact that you have an apiary is amazing. I want some of that honey.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay. Cool.
All right. Assalamu alaikum. I'll see you all inshallah next on Tuesday. We'll have another session with Sister Maryam.
Best of luck to everyone. If you have any questions, you can email me too.
All right. Thank you. Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you. Khuda Hafiz.
Good luck.